now rotate towards the sort of the concluding section of today's symposium, which will try to sort of zoom out a little bit and sort of think about this question of the planetarity of planetary governance and what the big picture of this is at stake. And for that this will be then led off by our final guest speakers, Nils Gilman and Jonathan Blake from the Berggruen Institute, who are, as you know, are co-sponsors of the co-presenters of today's event. So Nils and Jonathan and I met relatively recently, but it was a kind of lovely situation in which we kind of reached out to one another based on an inclination of some common interest, and found out very, very quickly that the overlaps in our approach and interest in these topics were considerable, and so it's been a lovely process of a acceleration of friendship and collaboration in this regard. One of the links as you see in the Google Docs we posted of links from there, several of them are from Noema magazine, which Berggruen publishes. One of the pieces in Noema is a piece that Nils and Jonathan wrote together on planetary governance as part of a book that they're writing together on that same topic. And the piece makes several rather provocative claims, quite, I think, corollary to our impulses, that, as I read, the planetary demands new binding institutions at the planetary scale, not simply member state institutions that operate on a volunteerist basis. This does not mean a single world state, we'll see. We envisioned a specifically delimited authority at the planetary level, or specifically planetary matters. They go on to say, in practice, this means we need binding planetary institutions that go beyond the Paris Accord for climate, beyond the WHO, for the syndromic surveillance and health, beyond the UN environmental program to deal with biodiversity, and a wholly new planetary institution to deal with tech-related risks. Together, these would form a new planetary tier of governance, which they call the subsidiary, above and beyond the nation state. And so let me then quickly introduce Nils and Jonathan. Nils Gilman is the Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, in which capacity he leads the Institute's research programs, directs its resident fellowship program. He's also, as mentioned, the deputy editor of Noema magazine. He's previously worked as Associate Chancellor at UC Berkeley, Research Director of Scenario Planning Consulting at Monitor Group, Global Business Network, among various other enterprise software companies. Jonathan Blake, with whom Nils is writing his book on planetary governance, is a political scientist, also the author of Contentious Rituals, Parading the Nation in Northern Ireland, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2019. He previously worked at the RAND Corporation, the Columbia Global Policy Initiative, and the Chimere Foundation. He holds his PhD from Columbia and BA from Berkeley. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce, in essence, in some ways, our co-hosts, the final guest speakers for today's symposium. We'll then have two final researcher projects, one on space law, one's on mode of planetarity, and I'll have a few concluding remarks. So with that, pass it to Nils and Jonathan. And as always, please post some questions for them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So first of all, let me say thank you to Strelka for offering to let us co-host, co-sponsor this event with you. And I also wanted to say that it's been amazing to watch all these presentations and the depth of the research and the extent of the thinking that has already gone in across the board from all of the presenters. I'm not going to make an attempt to summarize everything that you've already said, only to underscore what Benjamin was saying earlier, which is that there is an incredible amount of resonance between the kind of work we're trying to sponsor in our program on the planetary at the Berggruen Institute with what I think Strelka has been trying to do with the Terraforming project. And seeing the presentations today has only emphasized that to me. Now, I'm going to also apologize for the fact that this is actually relatively early days for Jonathan and I in the development of our content. We do not have a beautiful presentation that comes in. We don't have a presentation at all. We're just going to be speaking, so you're going to have to tolerate us as talking heads. What we'd like to do is talk a little bit about the basic thesis of the book. And I'll talk about specifically the kind of conceptual framework, and then Jonathan will talk about some specific kind of policy proposals that we plan to get towards in the end of the book. And I should just mention, we started writing this book in January, so it is, as I say, early days in our thinking on this topic. So the basic thesis of the book is that we have entered a new era that we and Strelka refer to as the planetary. And I think it's important just to try to distinguish specifically what distinguishes the planetary as an era. Benjamin was talking earlier, and several of the presentations have touched on the fact that part of the emergence of the planetary is a rise to sentience about the scale of planetary phenomena that is itself a result of sensor networks and algorithms and the sense-making apparatuses that have allowed us to understand that the planetary is a phenomenon and an integrated phenomenon at that. At a more conceptual level, though, of course, the planetary operates in contradistinction to the global and the era of globalization, which is the one where I believe exiting now. The global, and of course, there's a vast literature on the global and globalization, but to summarize it very quickly, the global was an era in which the analytic gaze, you might say, and I say this both in terms of the academic gaze and the political gaze, privileged specifically human flows. To just take one example, Manuel Castells spoke of globalization as a space of flows, but when you look at the flows he focused on, they were all anthropocentric rather things. The flows of services, the flows of goods, the flows of people, the flows of money, all things that were defined and delimited around human-centric activities. The planetary is specifically about the flows and the integrated nature of things that exceed the specifically human category. So, the carbon atmosphere, carbon obviously doesn't care about our borders. The oceanic plastics don't, the microbes don't, the Arctic ices, the presentation we just saw don't, biodiversities don't care anything about the kinds of human categories that we have. And yet we are inextricably, interstitially linked into those networks, as obviously the pandemic has made clear over the last year in a dramatic, immediate way, but that the rising awareness of climate change also does as well. The challenge, of course, is that, as several of the presentations have also remarked, we remain stuck from a governance perspective in a post-Westphalian world order. Now, I would say one thing about the post-Westphalian world order. One of the things that Jonathan and I will be documenting in the book is that the rise to hegemony of the nation state, the sovereign nation state as the privileged unit in governance is really a much more recent phenomenon. As late as the 1940s, you had a whole variety of different kind of governing institutions. You had mandates and colonies and empires and city-states and so on and so forth. It was really only with the coming of the post-colonial era in the 1950s and 60s that the nation state became the hegemonic unit of governance. And that was because the project of that era was a project which was a specifically national development oriented one. In economic development, political development, these were the specific projects which were the central political projects of the mid and late 20th century. We now have moved beyond that in a variety of ways that all of your presentations, I think, do an incredibly good job of exercising. And so what Jonathan and I want to do is ask, what is the kind of fundamental rethinking of governance structures that are needed to confront the planetary in a post-Westphalian world order? And so the phrase that we've harped on is subsidiarity, which also came up in one of the earlier presentations. And what I will do briefly now is give a very brief genealogy of the concept of subsidiarity, and then hand it over to Jonathan to think about why we think this is particularly applicable and useful for thinking about the planetary. So the first thing I want to emphasize about the concept of subsidiarity is that it has gone through many permutations and recombinations and reinterpretations. And what we're offering in our book will be yet another reinterpretation and re-understanding of what subsidiarity entails. But to talk briefly about what that set of iterations on the concept of subsidiarity have looked like over the last really 400 plus years, it begins, you might say, with the theorist Althusius, who was writing before the 30 Years' War, which led to the Treaty of Westphalia. He was a Protestant leader in of the city of Emden, and he proposed the concepts of subsidiarity primarily as a way of maintaining a certain amount of autonomy in the context of the religious wars which were tearing Germany and Central Europe apart during those years. And he wanted to say, rather than have the hegemon, the emperor, be able to dictate the local practices of religion, in general, he suggested that, that first of all, sovereignty resided not in the emperor, not in the monarch, but resided in the people, and therefore that governance ought to be as close to the people as possible, and therefore as low down in the political hierarchy as possible. This idea would then get picked up again in the middle of the 19th century in the response to the revolutions of 1848 in Europe by Hans von Ketteler, a Catholic theologian. So he turned it around, of course, because in Germany at that time, you were seeing the unification of Germany under Prussian, i.e. Protestant rule. And so von Ketteler, who was a Catholic, the Bishop of Mainz in Western Germany, he proposed a concept of subsidiarity to resist the centralizing, modernizing state, and again suggested that local orders should maintain their autonomies. This was then picked up about 40 years later in secular terms by Hans Gierke, who was a German legal scholar, who secularized the concept and said, actually, it should be, the principle of subsidiarity should be ordered on functional grounds and pushed as far down into the hierarchy as possible. And this was again to resist the centralizing impulses of the Bismarckian state. It was yet gone through a fourth iteration when Pope Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, a papal encyclical of 1931, proposed this as the basic operating model for the Catholic Church as a whole. And of course, he was proposing that as a way to resist the fascist state, which was attempting to take over all sorts of areas which had traditionally been managed by the Catholic Church. And then finally, most recently, it's become the central organizing, doctrine underpinning the Maastricht Treaty for the European Union in 1992. Now, we have a whole discussion we could get into about why there are severe limits to the way in which each of these applications of the concept has been developed. But what I would just emphasize now before I hand it over to Jonathan is that what all of these different concepts of subsidiarity have in common is that they argue that there's a hierarchy of individuals and institutions of governance, and that wherever possible, it's always preferable to have governance actions take place at the lowest level in the hierarchy, closest to the people and the entities, let's just say. So I don't think one of the things that we want to innovate is this is not just about human institutions, but the entities affected by the decisions. And so what all of these models resist, including our reinterpretation of this concept, as Ben Centerville said earlier, is the privileging of sovereign zones known as nation states. So this is really an evolution of the state form that we're going to be proposing. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Nils. And again, thank you, Benjamin, and to Strelka for inviting us. So picking up on what Nils was just saying, subsidiarity, historically has basically argued that things must be governed down at the lowest level, kind of down the chain that can provide still an adequate solution. So where we pick up on this is arguing that in the era of the planetary, in the age of what we now know about the planet, how it operates, as a whole system, the lowest level for some issues of governance is the planet itself. So again, while subsidiarity, typically is thought of as moving functions of governance only in one direction, which is down, the way we understand the concept and apply it to the contemporary situation is that some issues must be governed above where they currently are. So applying the principle of subsidiarity to planetary issues thus requires the creation of new institutions that are tailor-made for planetary governance. So I'm going to just briefly walk through this system of multi-level or multi-scalar governance that we have in mind. But as Nils said, it's still all early days. So any feedback from anyone would be much appreciated. So our institutional architecture is broadly functional. So our focus is on which functions of governance are best fit for each layer. Rather than thinking about the layers first, we think about the functions. So at the top level, again, are planetary institutions for planetary governance. So this I want to use, contrast with two two things that it's not. So first, we're not talking about world government here. A world state would be a general purpose jurisdiction, whereas we're thinking about functionally specific institutions with really a limited remit. So some areas that we think require planetary institutions are atmospheric carbon, biodiversity, public health surveillance. And what we have in mind for these sorts of things are institutions with the power to govern these issues, but only these issues. So to take atmospheric carbon, what we need is an institution that can decide on the limits that apply to the whole planet for carbon emissions and is somehow able to enforce those limits. But how the subplanetary institutions decide to reduce their emissions can be up to them. So whether lower down levels decide they want to go with nuclear, solar, degrowth, whatever it is, is up to the subplanetary political communities. What makes sense to them. The point is simply that the commitments that are made by the planetary institutions are binding, but at the same time the commitments are limited. So we envision a planetary institution on greenhouse gas emissions that has teeth, but is narrowly applied simply to that one issue. So planetary governance, second in our vision, is not global governance as it currently exists. So it's not the multilateral member state institutions where sovereign nation states come together to try and cooperate and coordinate around shared problems. So global governance, is exemplified when it comes to climate change in the Paris Agreement. And the well-known weakness of the Paris Agreement is that it is non-binding. And that's because simply that in the current structure of the system, the Westphalian system that we've been talking about, it has to be non-binding because it's an agreement between sovereign states. The sovereign states, remain the deciding unit. The problem is that here we are 5 years after Paris, and states haven't committed enough to actually meet the 2-degree target, and even on these limited commitments they've made, they're not even reaching them. They're not meeting them. So planetary governance, as we think about it, then is not an association of nation states. It's an institution that can make binding and enforceable decisions on planetary problems. So it's more than global governance, but less than world state. So at the bottom level of this multi-tiered system is local governance. Now, subsidiarity suggests that as many functions as possibly be pushed here, and we agree with that. But our primary commitment, again, is to getting the function to match the institution or the jurisdiction, rather than being overzealously committed to devolution for the sake of devolution. It just so happens that we think that many government institutions are best dealt with at a closer to the population than they currently are. So thinking about local governance takes less imagination than planetary governance, since it already exists and in many places is quite robust. So we think there should be further empowerment of local governments to allow leaders who are closer and more attentive to local problems and local demands to develop appropriate responses and be able to change nimbly as local conditions evolve. So many of the local problems that we think are going to be dealt with under the system are the specific manifestations of planetary problems. So the local effects of climate change, the local effects of a pandemic, for example. But I want to say that this is not about dumping problems into the laps of local leaders so that other authorities further up the chain can wash their hands of it. So devolution, we're well aware, has long been used not to empower local government, but to kill government writ large. And that's not what we have in mind. Local governments need the power and the resources to deal with problems and provide adequate solutions that meet the needs and demands of resident populations while simultaneously staying within planetary limits. So one place where we see a positive trend on the ground right now is about increased linkages between subnational governments around the world, what we think of as networked decentralization. So this is local authorities building horizontal peer networks to exchange ideas, expertise, and even resources. In the realm of climate change, for example, there's the C40 Cities for Climate leadership group, which one of the earlier presentations mentioned as well. And where that presentation pointed out that it's made up of 97 cities, so I don't need to say that. What they didn't point out is that these cities together make up 1/4 of global GDP. So this is a sizable, group of economic producers, and linking them together to come up with shared commitments, exchange ideas on how to do it, et cetera, we think is, could be applied in all sorts of realms. So not, cities working together, rural areas exchanging ideas, suburbs, trading best practices, and has the real potential to push things down, but then out. So the final major level in the multi-level governance system is the nation state. So states, we envision still have a role in the architecture, though they're much reduced. So what we want to do is move beyond the current thinking, move beyond the idea that the state is the default level, and see it simply as one level among many others. When and where it's the appropriate jurisdiction for the resolution of a challenge, great, it can take on that role. But if not, the function should be dealt with at the appropriate level, either above or below the state. So economic redistribution is one place where we think that it might make sense to stay at a national level due to the need for a large population for redistribution. And secondly, that there currently are existing national level social solidarities. But over time, we envision that solidarities might move up or down if the multi-level system works well. In fact, we hope that they might. So this function could move too. So this brings us to the final point, which is that the architecture of the system is dynamic. We prioritize function rather than units. So rather than the current system, which defaults to the nation state having the right to solve a problem, or at least the right of first refusal on that problem, we should start thinking about the problem and then which jurisdiction makes sense. So putting function first recognizes that the appropriate unit can change over time. Therefore constructing a system of robust, well-resourced, high-capacity institutions at all levels, from the local to the planetary, will give us the ability to solve, the collective problems of today and the ones that are coming down the pike for tomorrow. So with that, I'll hand it back. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Nils. Thanks, Jonathan, for that. I want to invite. I know we're considerably over time, but I also just wanted to invite, if there were questions or the comments for Nils and Jonathan, we'll give you a little bit of a chance to ask them. I wonder if I could ask then a first question as a sort of forward of this as well. It's quite clear that the argument Jonathan makes is sort of at the end, that the state is not necessarily the default function for this, at least the state as we see it. And I think Nils made a good argument for, even if we're talking about when the state is the appropriate result, the state itself is a constantly and rather deceptively quickly evolving institution that has taken on a number of different roles and functions, which is something that we've been addressing as well. And so on the one hand, it's not necessarily the state as we know it. It may be the state is doing something quite different than it has done before. On the other hand, it may be, not only not the nation state, but not a municipal governance or a regional government or anything else. These are also modes of the state. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what the alternative institutions are. I mean, part of the argument you're making is about institutions. Is it corporations? Is it platforms? Is it centralized network, decentralized? What are the other institutions that we should be looking at here? And I ask this with sort of as a follow-up to some of the questions to Holly and Ben as well about what do we mean by public in this regard, and what constitutes public and private, and are those conventional distinctions maybe the first casualty of the transformation we're talking about?
I can jump in on that, John. Maybe you'll want to add something. I'll just say briefly, Benjamin, that I think that the way in which non-state actors, whether they are for-profit or third sector actors, interact with the governing institutions will again vary by the functional area. So obviously, for things like social housing, for example, is an area that's absolutely rich with third sector actors. With other areas such as the sensor networks that are required to monitor the planetary, I think corporations are going to be absolutely key. I just think, for example, of the way we had some critiques earlier of the way in which some of the platforms have developed monopolies. Ben Cerveny talked about that pretty compellingly, but I think Ben is absolutely right that we want to turn those into open source or more open source-ish platforms so that kind of collaboration at the sensing level can work more effectively. So I do think that there's absolutely are partners at every level of governance, but I also would agree with your provocation, Benjamin, that I do think that the relationships between the public and the private, the for-profit and the nonprofit and the state sectors are likely to be pretty radically transformed by this kind of a re-architecting of the system. We haven't thought through all the details, and I think that it's going to be on a functional area by area basis. So that's the short answer.
We have one more question, but Jonathan, I wanted, before I ask that, if Jonathan, if you wanted to respond to the initial publication, and then I'll relay our question from the chat after that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nils. The only thing I would add is that we take, our view of actually existing governance of the moment already involves all of these things. There's no, like in housing, for example, like all these third sector actors. These things are all going on at all levels. Governance, the state, in some sense, while it maintains this ideological hegemony as kind of the core governance actor, is really already is only one among many. So we're trying to like think through, I guess, decentering its intellectual or ideological position, and to recognize what's already out there. That said, many of the other things that are out there, both private and, for that matter, state actors, are maybe not great examples of good ways to do it, but there are at least lessons that can be learned. Yeah.
Sure. So the question from the chat has to do with the Paris Accords, and which are characterized in the question in terms of their failures, that the mention of like a failure, at least to the extent to which for signatories to meet their obligations that are signed on there in one way or another. And I think the gist of the question kind of speaks to the question of something like a last instance sovereignty within the kind of multipolar, multi-temporal, multi-level assemblage that you propose of enforceability. And I understand quite clearly that what you're suggesting is, let's start with the problem space and devise a governing structure around that, rather than start with the presumption of a sovereign zone and then try to give it assignments. But is there a kind of final moment of enforceability, or how does that relate to the question of mobilization here in this way? Otherwise, rather than it just being a kind of multiplication of legislative multiplication of sort of discursive imaginaries rather than the planetary ones, as you so well described.
Great question. So let me say two things. About it. So first of all, a slightly different way to frame the question is, why would existing national elites be willing to give up power to some higher entity? And here I have to say, I have some personal experience in this, having worked, as Benjamin mentioned earlier, as the Associate Chancellor at UC Berkeley, which, as some of you may know, UC Berkeley is embedded in a much larger university system, the University of California as a whole. And I became acutely aware when I had that job that many of the things that we were held accountable for as senior administrators at Berkeley were things that we had no control over. And so things went wrong, we were blamed, even though we didn't actually have the decision rights to control the things that would have been able to actually effectuate change to prevent the bad things from happening. Without getting into the details, I think this is a problem that many, many national governments are going to face with respect to planetary challenges. And there will become an incentive at a certain point that you do not want to be held accountable for things you do not control. And so I think that is the pathway towards a potential emergence out of this. Now, with that said, I think one of the links in the Google Doc that you sent around was an interview that John and I just did with Francis Fukuyama. And I think Fukuyama was right to say that, when core interests of a nation state come to be challenged, they may decide, as he put it in the interview, to just say, fuck you, and not be willing to put up with having what they see as their sovereignty infringed upon. And I see some of the chat that's happening over in the chat box here. The voluntarist enforcement is something that has been not effective, just put it mildly, on this topic. And yet at the same time, we do know that there are, there have been decisions that have been made which are globally enforced, partly because people do not want to be seen as humani hostis humani, the enemy of all mankind. And there is a shaming possibility on this. Now, will there be some defections? Any kind of governance system is always going to have people who resist, people who exit. We're never going to get to a zero emissions world because there's always going to be people who want to do barbecuing in their backyards and you're not going to be able to stop them, right? The question is whether we can move massively towards a different system where there is some enforceability. And here I think that, you know, there are examples of this, even at the transnational level, that are important. The UN Security Council, none of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council gave up any of their sovereignty by joining this, but by becoming permanent members of this, the UN Security Council actually has been entirely successful in its fundamental mission over the last 75 years, which is to prevent a direct war between great powers. All right.
Mhm.
Now, there are many reasons for that, and we don't have to get into all that, but there are reasons why at times, even great powers and certainly smaller powers are willing to give up their authorities because they do not want to be held responsible for things like a nuclear war. And obviously a nuclear war is acute, but you know, catastrophic global climate change, a human bioengineered super serious pandemic would be, you know, could be as or more lethal than a global nuclear war. So I do think there are reasons why people may end up at some point being willing to take a pathway away from the rigorous defense of sovereign nation state as we have come to understand it over the last 60, 70 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So Nils, Jonathan, thanks again for the presentation. Thanks also to Berggruen for this. It's a lovely meeting of the meeting of the minds, meeting of the networks here together. And so look forward to continuing with that with you.